Okay, the first technique we're going to look at is electronic music in film and games composition. So why use electronic music? Why go for that? Well, for one thing, you have very powerful music making devices at your fingertips, the computer, which allows for the creation of completely new sounds and musical structures. For example, through the processing of acoustic instruments or using synthesis to do things that instruments can't do. And here's a nice quote again from the Carlin and Wright book. It is as much as a compositional idea to sit down and be tampering with audio as it is to sit in front of a piano and be writing a melody. So you can think about timbral-based composition as well as note-based composition. And so here's some examples of the use of electronic music in film. So we've got Drive, Monsters, Blade Runner, Apocalypse Now. So have a listen to these pieces. So pause this video while you do that, and then think about, can you hear the techniques that are being used, and which of these might you be able to recreate? You can then look at some of these articles for more examples. So here's some articles that list some other pieces. The second technique is imitating real instruments. So why would we want to do this? Why would we want to use software to imitate real instruments? Well, if you're making soundtrack on a budget, then using software instruments in place of real musicians and instruments will be much cheaper. Working with software instruments may also be less time consuming. And even if real musicians and instruments will be used, software instruments can be used to create demo versions so that directors have some music to work to. So directors often like to have some placeholder music that they can actually use to help them come up with ideas for and edit a scene. However, there are some potential pitfalls here. So software imitations generally never sound as good as the real thing. If you invest in something like Vienna Instruments or something like that, then you can get pretty close, but that's going to set you back quite a lot of money, storage space, and computing power. If the music is obviously made with standard software instruments, then it draws attention to this inferiority. So yeah, if you're hearing what is clearly the EXS-24 or some other kind of sampler software instrument, it just doesn't sound as good as the real thing, and it draws attention to its absence rather than lending something to the film. So here's a quote from Walter Murch in Sound on Film, who says, "For me, it's incredibly emotional. The air has a lot to do with it. It's a sort of perfume of sound. Sound without air has no smell. When you have air around it, suddenly it hits you like a smell you haven't smelled in 15 years, and memories come back." So using software instruments, as well as they sound inferior, they just don't have the emotional quality that real instruments recorded by actual players in an actual room will sound like. But if you really want to use software imitations and want to do an orchestral piece but make it sound as realistic as possible, then there are various strategies for doing this. So this Sound on Sound article here offers some fantastic strategies for making software instruments sound more real. And you can try these out in one of the practical exercises below. Sometimes you might want a non-orchestral approach. So, for example, I've had projects before where people have tried to imitate a jazz combo, and have tried to do this using software instruments and generally fail pretty dismally. But using royalty-free samples of actual instruments can be a cost-effective strategy rather than using software instruments. And again, there's another technique for this in one of the exercises on Blackboard. Okay, so moving on to these exercises, During the session today, I'd really like you to have a go at one or more of these. So, first one, electronic music composition. Have a listen to these 2 tracks and analyze what's going on. Okay, you should recognize or be able to hear some of these kind of elements. So a simple piano melody, a granular drone, high sustained pad, a looped pad sound, looped bell and mallet sounds, repeating low bass note, a noisy resonant wind sound and percussive sounds. So as well as using software instruments, you can use the audio files to help you create the loop drone and percussive sounds. So these are provided for you. And you might wish to rewire Ableton Live into Logic for greater range of sounds, and here's some instructions for doing that. Okay. Second exercise, creating a jazz track from samples. So there's some samples provided to do this. And if you want to download more, you can do from these links here. This one here, you'll need to log on to be able to download things. So just to let you know that, really. Okay, third exercise is making orchestral parts sound real-ish. Okay, as real as possible. Okay, so download the MIDI file of Pirates of the Caribbean, the He's a Pirate theme by Hans Zimmer, and import it into Logic, or Pro Tools, or Live if you wish. Reassign the MIDI parts to various orchestral instruments using the EXS24 or equivalent, and I suggested using different string instruments in the pop strings folder. Use this article to help you from Sound on Sound. It's the one we mentioned before. Key points include using layers of violin. So if you want to if you want this to make this sound like an orchestra, then use sort of several instruments, several layers of violin, use several layers of viola, of cello, and of double bass, and make the parts slightly different. Okay, so they're not exactly the same thing, just doubled up. Avoid boring blocks of chords. Use varying MIDI volume control. So in real performances, you get varying velocities. And you can use MIDI volume control as well, or automation to make things get louder and softer, so increase the dynamics. Use varying attack times and velocities. This makes it for a more natural sound. You can humanize the tracks so everything isn't on the grid. And then use reverb. So this idea, going back to this idea of air. Okay, we can kind of simulate that by using reverb. So when an orchestra is recorded, we don't just hear the dry sound of the instruments. What we're hearing is the sound of the instruments in a space, and that really adds to the naturalness, the warmth, the emotion of the piece. So use of reverb is really, really key here. So we can use reverb in several ways to enhance the realism of the strings, and then to blend reverb with other soundtrack elements. And then if needed, we can use short reverb times and high pass filters to avoid cluttering up the mix, making it too muddy, so too much kind of low end. If you enjoy doing this and you want to do some more of it, then there's some more famous themes that you can get from this link. Okay, so please spend some time now having a look at one or more of those exercises. And then finally, for further study, Blackboard in the reading list, there's more resources on composing music. And then worth particular mention is Winifred Phillips' A Composer's Guide to Game Music, which is available as a hard copy in the library or electronically. Okay, thank you for listening.